On this episode of Narcissist Apocalypse, we talk with an abuse survivor named Molly. And Molly endured a lifetime of narcissistic abuse at the hands of her mother and husband. It's a story of intergenerational trauma, people-pleasing, boundaries, reenactments, silent treatments, shame, and parental alienation. Welcome to Narcissist Apocalypse, everyone. I am Brandon Chadwick, and with me today we have Molly. How are you?
I'm doing well, Brandon. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you for being here. And if you want to be a guest like Molly is today, please do go to our website at narcissistapocalypse.com and click on the guest form button at the top of the page. There you can read all of our instructions, and please read them all and either send us an email at narcissistapocalypse@gmail.com or fill out our guest form and press the submit button, and please do send it in the format that we ask for. And we do not have a content warning for this episode. There's no content warning for today. And today you're going to hear Molly's story, and Molly's mom had tentacles all over her life, influencing it negatively to this day through her abusive marriage, which was a reenactment, and thus giving the dad more power of persuasion over her own kids once he's teamed up with her mom. So a big thank you to Molly for being here. And now I'm going to get out of my way and your way. Molly, the floor is now yours.
Thanks, Brandon. It's really a pleasure to be on this podcast with you. And I want to begin by, again, thanking you for the work you do. It has been a tremendous help to me as I navigate this healing journey. And my story is interesting in some ways because it actually involves three generations that I have experienced narcissistic abuse from. So it begins with my mother, who I would describe as a grandiose narcissist. She was emotionally abusive and manipulative my entire life. And then the story moves on to my ex, who was more of a covert narcissist, who used many of the same techniques of emotional manipulation as my mother did, especially silent treatment and withholding. And finally, the third generation is actually my three daughters, who are all adults now, but I would describe them as having been swept into this narcissistic abuse through years of parental alienation at the hands of my ex and my mother. And I've only heard one other of your episodes where the daughter and the mother had the similar dynamic that I did, such that the mother cultivated an idealized relationship with the ex and discarded the daughter. So as an example, when I sold my marital home 3 years after the separation agreement in the year 2018, my ex and my daughters moved in to my mother's home, the house that I grew up in. But in 2019, something very interesting happened, which I'll get to when I progress through kind of the timeline. But it was around 2019 that my own daughters stopped communicating with me, and the youngest pulled a very deceitful backstabbing attack that really took me by absolute surprise, was shocking to me. And this was in the period of early November 2019. But let me go back in time and give you a picture of what it was like for me growing up. So my mother, as I said, was my first narcissist. And my father was unfortunately an enabler, albeit he really was also somewhat of a protector and a shielder, but he never directly put a stop to the abuse. And in fact, he always framed it as an issue between my mother and I, like this was a mother-daughter conflict and you and your mother need to work it out and, go fix this, go apologize, go talk to your mother, always sending me, if you will, on this kind of errand of reparations. And that was just kind of the norm for me. That's what I did. But unfortunately, that kind of framing left me confused and conditioned to accept and rationalize my mother's abusive behavior. So starting from my earliest period, I'm an only child of a mother who actually had 2 stillbirths before me. And this is something I grew up knowing about, which I think kind of plays into my sympathy for her and most definitely plays into my father's sympathy for my mother. She had 2 full-term pregnancies and lost both of the babies. And that is just one of the most traumatic things to go through, I'm sure. And so that certainly was kind of like in the back of my mind always as I was growing up. But I was trained, I always say trained, by this narcissist to be a people pleaser, to be a high achiever, and I was constantly praised for being this independent child. So, of course, I was excellent in academics. The teachers loved me. And frankly, I loved my teachers. And I'm very grateful for all the great teachers I've had in my life, because I think they've definitely helped me become the person that I am. They, believed in me and they supported me and they valued me and my hard work and intelligence and so forth. So that definitely is kind of like a 2-edged sword, right? And as a child, I was pretty confident, but I also had trouble with friendships because I was growing up traveling overseas because of my father's work. So I was always the outsider, the new kid. And that was, of course, very emotional, very challenging. So there were many periods where I would feel nervous and unsure and uncertain, and then have to make my way into new friend groups and new dynamics. And that happened a lot. But nonetheless, I still had this kind of can-do attitude, hard work ethic. I remember an incident in 4th grade where I cheated on a science exam, and oh my God, the hammer came down on me, the disappointment, the guilt, the shame, right? How could you do this? And, you're more capable than that. And my teacher was disappointed in me. My mother had words for days for me. But that was kind of like a time where I think I kind of picked up the pace and started doing even better in school because of obviously the shame, the guilt, feeling so bad. So it was interesting because I was also, going into the next year, 5th grade, I had an amazing, very feminist teacher who, it was a new thing for women to call themselves Ms. at the time. And she was a particularly powerful young teacher who really believed in me. And I remember standing up in class and defending the student that I felt she was unfairly treating. And at the end of the year, she didn't chastise me for it. In fact, she praised me for it. And I ended up winning an award that year for being kind of like this can-do student. This is my student who wakes up and says, "Good morning, God," not, "Oh, good God, it's morning." And, I won the best student of the class award that year. So what that shows is in this academic world, I am getting praised and supported for my good work ethic, my good attitude, my hard work ethic, like I said, my attention to my studies, my improvement, right? And as well as being kind of like a defender of the underdog. Anyway, so that's kind of like one little scenario, but nonetheless, back to kind of like the story of my growing up. So my mother and father actually were married my whole life. My dad passed away in 2013. And frankly, that's kind of like where things started to go downhill in my life. But as I mentioned, I grew up overseas throughout my formative years, having exposure to all kinds of cultures and languages and food. So it really gave me a very rich experience growing up. But one of the things that also happened during these times where we were overseas is my mother would often have maids or servants in these various locations. And mind you, my mom grew up as a child of immigrants in the late 30s and 40s. So she was really working class immigrant family. Her family worked in the steel mills and, lived in a very immigrant rich community. So she's not someone coming from these upper echelons, yet when she was in this overseas lifestyle, she lived that kind of more elite lifestyle. So there was always this kind of push to do very upper class types of things. So as a child, when we were not overseas, we were back in a particular area of the country where, there's a lot going on culturally in the arts. So there was this unusual little mix of where do we belong, right? But I was always taken with her to these kind of high-end places. So I was her companion, her company, if you will. And that kind of is interesting because she was never really able to maintain any long-term friendships. She would idealize someone and eventually discard them. And I saw this happen many times in my childhood. And so I was a substitute friend, if you will, companion, almost like an extension of her, really. But I was also idealized for not giving her any trouble. For example, I could brush my teeth and put myself to bed. She would always praise me for that. She would tell people about that. Oh, she just puts herself to bed. It's just amazing. Like I had accomplished something so great. But what I realized, of course, on this end of the spectrum is she couldn't care for someone who really needed her. So it was fantastic for her that I didn't need her in any way, right? But at the same time as not needing her, she also had lots of quirky expectations about, like, making sure dishes were done a particular way. Or, for example, we had carpeted stairs. And I remember her telling me one time, don't walk up the middle of the stairs. You're going to flatten the carpet and it's going to wear out. The funny thing is, many years later, as an adult, I was walking up the stairs on the edge like I had always done since she told me that when I was in middle school. And she looks at me and she says, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm walking on the edge." She's like, "Why are you doing that?" I said, "Because you told me to do that." Right? So there's this amnesia for whatever expectations she had ever had for me. Like, it didn't even occur to her again. So obviously, if I were to analyze that, it would be like, she would throw out these demands or, strictures or some kind of control, but it really didn't matter. What mattered is she was in control and she had a demand and you had to live up to it, right? So that's a little scenario of something I dealt with. Now, again, as I mentioned, I was always pressured academically, to win awards, the highest honors, to achieve the highest things. On the flip side, my father was the one who took me to the library. He's the one who took me to museums. He's the one who read me bedtime stories. He's the one who pushed me on the swings at the playground. He's the one who took me, to our local parks and so forth. And those are like the real kind of meaningful childhood moments that I needed as a kid. But he's the one who did that. I remember one time when I was in middle school or early high school, and we went to one of these same museums when they were having an event, and it was outside and it was rather warm. And we finally coaxed my mom into coming with us because she never would come when we went to these types of outings together. And when I we finally coaxed her to come, she complained the whole God blessed time. She was outside making faces. She was too hot. She was this, she was that. And it just ruined, the outing. It was like such a hardship to pulling teeth to get her to come. And then once she's there, she's just miserable and just ruining the moment, ruining the very nice, simple outing, right? And another strange thing she would do, if we ever bought gifts for her birthday, she would never use them. She never liked them. She never appreciated them. And it's like you could never get her something that she really wanted, right? So here's my dad doing all of these kind things, these very age-appropriate activities with me, taking me to have all these wonderful experiences that every kid benefits from. But my mom would badmouth him and complain about him all the time. She would use me as her sounding board. And it was just something she did for years and years and years. And I finally, when I got into high school, I just couldn't take it anymore. And I was like, well, for God's sakes, why don't you just get a divorce if you're that unhappy, right? So it was that miserable, offloading she did on me. So I was her, again, sounding board. And at the same time, she would always complain when she was driving. She had a lot of road rage. She would swear and be outraged when driving. It was like everyone was out to get her. She perceived threat everywhere. And as I mentioned earlier, she would cycle through best friends, idealizing someone and discarding them completely. Now, one of the biggest things my mom as a narcissist did was she would befriend someone who was going through the same life stage as me. And she would attend to that person's significant events and not mine. On a smaller scale, for example, I had a friend in college who came over and spent the night, and my mom befriended her, chatted with her, pretended like she was friends with her, and would disparage me in front of my friend or make fun of me in front of my friend. And then my friend would laugh and they would yeah, she's like that, ha, ha, ha. And it's like she would align with this friend against me. Okay. Also, my mom was very restrictive of my friends in high school, always complaining that they weren't good enough for me, that why are you spending time with those people? They're not like us, or they're not like our class of people, and so on. But she would impose other people, like if she had somebody we were connected with, that she would impose on me. Other people she might impose on me, but it had to be her decision. In high school, I had a boyfriend who I really liked a lot. She ruined that relationship completely for me. She made me break up with him, and she pressured me over and over, and I eventually broke up with him. I'm still in touch with that boyfriend, and he remembers her invasive, demanding, and bizarre behaviors. So it's interesting to have someone be able to reflect on that with me, after so much time. It's very helpful, actually. But so that's one example, right? She would control those relationships. She preferred one boy over another. She pushed me towards that friend and want me to be with them versus him, and so forth. Other things she did, like when I went to college, the reason I left my house is because I was actually commuting distance from my undergraduate institution. But my mom was putting so much pressure on me and being so controlling. And again, this is where my dad kind of came in and was like, oh, you two need to work this out, right? Like not recognizing what's the abusive behavior that's happening, how she's actually starting fights and so forth. But instead, like putting it on my shoulders as well. So eventually I was like, I need to get out. I need to go live in the dorm and so on. So halfway through my sophomore year, I ended up going to the campus, living on campus, had a great time. I loved it. But she never once came to visit me the entire time, even though I was literally 15 minutes from my childhood home. But she never came to visit me. She never brought me things. She never came and had lunch with me. She never came to see the campus, nothing like that. On the other hand, my dad would. He'd come bring me groceries, or he'd meet me for lunch and so forth. Eventually, when I got to the point of my graduation week, now, mind you, I've done phenomenally well. I'm in all the honor societies. I'm in Phi Beta Kappa. I'm in, all the honor societies for my major, for example, Psychi, which is for psychology, Golden Key, Omicron Delta Kappa, all these honor societies, and of course Phi Beta Kappa being the biggest one. And she insisted, oh, you better be Phi Beta Kappa, and you better achieve that, and so forth. Fine. My graduation week, there's all these events. You come to campus, you meet the professors, this and that and the other, and there's like a special big formal dinner and dance at the end of the week in a beautiful venue in this wonderful city. And she ruined the whole thing. Got into arguments, complained, was sour-faced. We're sitting at dinner one night. She's complaining through the whole thing. And it took a lot to get my father angry. He very rarely raised his voice. Like I can think of 3 times, honestly. This was one of them. He raised his voice and was like, you need to calm down. Stop that right now, to her. And it was like one of the first times he raised his voice like that. But it must have been that bad, right, for him to finally say something. And, on the day of my graduation, we are in a very significant location, right? And this is such an amazing moment, right? There are families there who are just happy their kids are even there. Never mind, I just achieved the highest honors. I got the highest grade point average and got summa cum laude, right? Which is the highest ranking of your grade point average. Below that is magna. But in the program for the graduation, it said magna cum laude. And she literally says at the graduation, why are you magna cum laude? And I said, it's a misprint not a misprint, but it's the grades they had before my last semester. By my final semester, I had the highest grade point average and I was summa. And that's on my diploma and all of that. So here we are in the most precious moment and she's ruining it. Just, I don't know if I can use these words, but she's just shitting all over everything, right? She's just ruining it. And this kind of continued. So right around this time, as I'm graduating, I had met my ex and we were anticipating getting engaged and she knew that. So she had animosity towards him at this time as well. And obviously here I am trying to build a relationship with someone else and she's just ruining it in every possible way, including the day of my graduation where he is also attending and celebrating and bringing me flowers and all of this. So from that point forward, she did a number of things where each time, again, that I had another major milestone. So this is graduation, right? Undergrad. And then when I got engaged, and then when I had my bridal shower and my wedding and my baby shower, she never came to any of those events. But like I said before, she would befriend someone who was going through similar things, and she would tell me all about it. She would tell me every detail of that other person's baby shower, bridal shower, engagement, wedding, and on, like absolutely rubbing my face in it. And she would, again, refuse to come to my events. And all the while, there's these periods of ignoring and silent treatment. So as I mentioned, this is kind of her mode of control and her mode of harm and abuse, is to ignore me, give me silent treatments, and then I have to go and do the repair. And so this cycle was my whole childhood. I'm going to backtrack for a second and also tell you, going back in time for a moment, because there was a period of my childhood where I realized I didn't see her very much and I didn't have very many issues with her. And this is when we were overseas in a far East Asian country where she had a maid, a cook, a gardener, a driver, a seamstress, and had a lot of elite friends who were doctors and wealthy folks. We met really significant people in that culture's like social and arts world. All these major people, we met them. So she was living this major high life, right? I honestly don't remember having many interactions with her for those, it was almost 2 years that we were there. I don't remember really seeing her very much. And there was no tension and so forth during that time because she wasn't taking care of me. I was being taken care of by these other people. I'd be driven to school by the chauffeur. The maid would pick me up. She'd look after me. They would feed me and so on. So I barely saw her during this time, which is really interesting. But coming back to this timeline where I'm graduating, getting engaged, and so on, I think as I began to start my own relationship, I was convinced I was going to have a better one compared to my parents because I could do better. I am a hard worker. I can make this good. I am also learning psychology. So I'm going to get this right. And I'm going to, be this gangbuster woman who's going to lead her own life. And so that's kind of the mentality I had going into my own future. But I was also trained, obviously, to give people second chances, right? I was trained to make repairs and forgive and forget and start over, right? I was never taught that I could have my feelings of hurt. I could have my feelings of my own demands, my own requirements for relationship, basis, right? I wasn't allowed to have a demand. I wasn't allowed to have a need. In fact, the only time my mom would show any kind of sympathy towards me is if I was literally crying my eyes out. And then it would trigger something in her and she'd feel really bad. And I would have to be pushed really darn far to get to the point of tears, right? But that was the only time she would show any kind of empathy for me. So I want to share a few of the strange narcissistic traits of my mom that I observed. And I think this is really helpful because having these kinds of lists and understanding that these are patterns has really helped me in my healing process. And I hope for the listeners that if they encounter these things, they'll be able to say, oh, wow, I've seen that too. Oh my gosh, that's not normal, right? So as I've mentioned, one of the things is she would align with others against me. And then even on my engagement, there was a really good friend of mine who came to stay overnight because he lived further away. And so he could attend the engagement party. She literally ignored me in front of me and him and spoke directly to the friend and said to him, and he still remembers this, I wish she was marrying you instead. Can you imagine? Right in front of my friend. What's my poor friend supposed to do? Right. So there's this aligning with others against me, ruining special occasions, the silent treatment, absolutely unable. She's absolutely unable to self-reflect. That would be a trigger for her that would send her off the wall. She could never take accountability for anything she ever did. Another thing she would do is what I would call emotional escalation. So if I was saying, hey, I don't like this, or I was expressing a demand or a need or a contradictory point of view from her, she would emotionally escalate and she would do it like this. She would, how could you, this puffing. And it's she would suck in her breath. And then this would make me scared as a kid, right? She would go, I will not have you, this kind of emotional escalation, right? Oof, it would make my head spin. She would blame me for her feelings, right? While doing this kind of like dramatic escalation. And then another weird thing she did, I would call it bodily imposition or bodily boundary breaking. And by that, I mean, will do something gross, right, in front of you or in front of others and kind of like impose themselves on you. For example, she would, come down to the dinner table without her bra, just in her pajamas or her nightgown. She would pass gas in front of all of us. She would pick her nose. She would get changed in front of me. And these are very bizarre bodily like boundary breaking that she would do. But it is a sign of this kind of like imposing onto others, right? Like this is her space and she's going to come in it however she wants, right? Yet she'll have particular demands for you. Like none of us were doing that. Like none of us would be imposing these boundaries or breaking these kinds of boundaries. None of us, meaning my father and I, right? So that was a very strange thing. But all of these things together really create this very tense atmosphere. And I think that kind of like the bulk of how my childhood felt. It was very, very tense, and you could never please her. Like even, for example, like wanting to get your ears pierced more. Oh, you'd have that escalation. Oh, what do you mean? How you can't do that? The demands would be like, oof, off the charts. So never could I express, any kind of desire to individuate in any way and to really be my own person and make my own choices about dress or hair or clothing and, and like things like piercing your ears and so forth. The demands were extremely high.
So when it comes to your mom, all of these things are happening. She's exerting control. You tell the story of her life when you are, overseas and how you kind of get ignored here for a little. She's living a life there where everything's pretty taken care of. My assumption here is that maybe she's not that upset with your dad at this time as well, because she is somebody while she's there. She's hanging out with people. People are like big in the world, people who are higher up in their countries as far as the order of things, government organizations and things like that. Like I'm to do. And then you're back here or wherever you move, things aren't like that anymore. You're not being treated in the same way again. The people she's hanging out with aren't up in that echelon. So it sounds like here is like, she's controlling over you. She might be competing with you a lot, but then there's something else in my mind here that's saying she still wants you to be a specific thing, even though she tears you down. Because if you get involved with the right person, she might be able to get back to where she was there, because that's where she needs to be. And she's not doing it herself. She's wanting other people to do it. And if you're not living up to that thing, she's going to tear you down. So maybe at that time she might have liked your dad briefly, but she'll tear him down because she just needs to be this thing.
The grandiose narcissist. She is like, an elite person now. She's in the highest echelons, right? And so I was in second and third grade when we were in that particular Far East Asian country where she's meeting with literally the most famous rock star of the time, the most famous. She's the godmother to the biggest folk music hero of that country. Can you imagine? We meet two of the biggest movie stars, designer who's really popular at the time. There's a sports player, I won't say the sport because they'll give it away, who's like the top of that sport. We do meet with family members who are related to significant government people from that country, right? So yes, absolutely. Now, at the same time, my dad's traveling a lot when we were in that country. So he's traveling to other countries while being there, doing his work. And so he wasn't around a lot. So she's Yeah, so she's living this grandiose life. Now, mind you, when we come back, I'm in 4th and 5th grade. She puts me in a private school, an elite private school, where I'm friends with daughters of ambassadors, okay, other wealthy families in the area, well-known families in our particular region, right? And now that's where I started getting that pressure. That's where when I cheated on the test, I got all the pressure, and you got to be the best. And I won the award. And I was in piano lessons too as a little kid. I was frightened out of my mind to go to the piano recital, but got to get dressed up in the fancy little dress, and she parades you around. So it is a remarkable shift. It's where she's living this absolute grandiose lifestyle, and now she's got to channel all that back on me. And my dad, right? And it was a huge demotion, if you will, for her to come back to this world where these amazing things are not happening for her. So that just it's a magnifying glass on me, really. A huge magnifying glass. I sometimes think back and I'm like, how the hell did I survive all that? That is so much pressure. And thank God I've got some resiliency. Thank God I've got some fortitude. But, I'm tired of my resiliency. I deserve a break too. I think what I also learned at that time, which is really important, is that, I have to be the absolute best or I will be discarded. I can never crack or have any faults or any legitimate needs. And that is certainly something that has taken its toll, throughout the remainder of my life. But that's the message I learned.
So this is the message that you learned. And this story is not just about your mom. It's about the relationship you're about to tell us about. And then it'll be about your other relationship with children as well. But it really all starts here with your mom. And intergenerational trauma, and how, unbeknownst to you, you're about to find someone who's not that different from your mom. You don't know it yet, and you're reenacting it. And, your mom plays a significant role here throughout your whole entire life, because this person might not have been the person your mom might have originally approved of, because your mom wants to get to a certain place. And maybe she looked at that person and said, this guy's not going to help my daughter get to where she needs to be, because my daughter needs to get here so I can be here. So, right off the bat, your mom is going to be now against you in so many ways. She'll make alliances along the way, but your mom is not going to actively be on your team. And because of that, it makes the other side, when it gets doubled, that much stronger, because it's 2 against 1 at that point, to then transform children into a bigger team. It's easier when there's 2 people who might not who are all saying the same thing against one person. So your mom plays a big role. So I guess tell us about the beginning of the relationship, and, the beginning of a reenactment for you and another type of abuser that you're about to, be in a relationship for a very long time.
Yeah. I always say I married my mother, and that sounds bizarre, but I married those patterns that I was so familiar with. I immediately found familiarity and was like, oh, this sounds familiar. This feels familiar. Let's proceed, right? All unconsciously, of course, at that time. Another thing I want to also share, Brandon, is kind of like the wider situation for me. As I mentioned, I'm an only child, so that already isolates me. There's no one else witnessing what's happening. Another thing that isolated me, and again, it's not necessarily purposeful, but it's just the situation of my life, these traveling overseas, coming back, traveling overseas. So there's no long-term friends or connections that are seeing what's going on in my life, right? But all right, so here's me. I'm in college. I meet my ex. We met, I think it was my senior year. He was at a different school in the area, and he had just graduated, and I was a senior. Interestingly, he actually came the previous year to my induction ceremony to one of the honor societies I was in, because he was the officer from his institution with his friends. So they came as guests to our event. And I briefly remember seeing him kind of in the background, but we didn't interact. But I was a senior. I was out dancing at the club. I was out with my friends. He was with a big group of friends, and we ended up dancing with their friends. And, we were having a great time. Everybody looked really cool. They were all very good looking. Everybody was very stylish. And then here's something interesting. The first time I saw him, we interacted a little, and I kind of had a little interest, but then I had a sense, I was like, I'm not entirely sure. Is he gay or is he straight? I couldn't tell. This becomes relevant later. So anyway, that's how I met him the first time. And then when we were out again another time, this was like the fall of my senior year, I saw him out, and then we exchanged numbers, and he was a great dancer. He was so stylish, and I'm a young woman. I'm just having the best old time. So anyway, we ended up making a date. He had a nice car, and he dressed well, and he smelled good, and we're going out to dinner and shopping in the nice area of, this city, and going out to the movies and, events and so on. And if I were to say, what is it that drew me in? It's like the first time I really felt seen. He was paying attention to me. There was like an exchange, like we enjoyed the same things. We could have fun together. One of the first times we went out to like the theater, I remember I got tickets to something and he came, but he was late. And it was the first time I'd ever been late to anything. And I was like, oh my God, I'm late. Like it was shocking. I've never been on time since then. But anyway, this was really fun, and another thing he would do is he would show up on my campus. I'd be studying or walking around or doing something, and he would show up on my campus and find me. And I thought that was the coolest thing. Here I am, this young woman. It's like, oh, he's there. He found me. It's like, it felt so kismet, not creepy at all. He would find me. Now, I come to find out later, his father actually got his doctoral degree from the same institution that I was at. So he was familiar with the campus and so forth. We shared interests, and he's this young person. He's going on for a master's degree. So like, I was thinking we're both very academic minded, right? He was in the same honor society as I was. His dad got a doctoral degree. So it's like, I'm imagining and believing we are on this same path of like pursuing higher education, because my intention after graduation was to go on for a master's degree as well. Now, when I started seeing him, I was also seeing someone else at the time. Like I was dating another guy, and I didn't think anything of it because I was like, I'm a young woman. I'm going to date this one or date that one. I don't, nobody's exclusive. Let me have a good time. So at some point I felt like I had to tell him because I was more interested in seeing him and not the other person. And somehow I felt like I needed to confess. That's a marker right there, putting myself in that kind of vulnerable position. I mean, if I just wanted to see him, I should have just kept seeing him and, forget the other one. But for some reason, I felt like I had to say something. And my ex went into this emotional fit. It was similar to my mom's huffing and puffing and, this grand, like, oh my God, the earth is, shaking. And he literally started to have a seizure-like event, and it freaked me the hell out. And I was crying uncontrollably. It left me feeling very guilty and bad. So here's where my first trauma bond was clinched. I'm bad. I caused this horrible emotional reaction. Oh my God, I'm so guilty. I need to make up to it. I am a bad me, right? It fit right into my narrative, and it hooked me right in. Another thing that kind of hooked me was that I kept finding signs that he was the one. It was meant to be, like I had this dream, and in the dream it said I was going to meet a warrior. And then I find out his name and his native language means warrior. And I was like, oh, this is it. This is meant to be. And, I guess another thing is, I've got this romantic side to me. I want to have this beautiful romance story of like meeting and your soulmate and so forth. So I was kind of swept up in this idea. Another thing is we ended up being near each other many times prior to meeting, like at that, that honor society. induction. And another strange thing, his house is in a cul-de-sac, like where he grew up during high school and into college. And it just so happened that my mother used to go to this woman across the street and get her nails done there. And so I had gone to that other house a couple of times. So it's like I was near him, right? I always saw these as like, oh, wow, look at the proximity. We're near each other. For God's sakes, we live in the same area. Proximity is possible, right? Like it's something special. But at the time, I just thought it was like this sign of something meant to be, right? So, as we dated, he was fun. He was engaging. There were minimal issues. We'd go out, we'd eat, we'd go out, we'd dance, we'd go out to the movies, we'd hang out with his friends, we'd go shopping, and stuff like that. And it was such a respite from the tension with my mother, right? So obviously we've got this contrast happening at this period too that makes it that much more engaging for me, that much more desirable. And, I'm a young woman. I want to have my own life. I want to have my own relationships. And here I am trying to do that. So as I mentioned previously, I was engaged right at the end of my graduation from college. And then when I was planning to go, so by the end of the summer, I had gone and visited a couple of master's programs that I had applied to, and I decided on one in California. And I said, I'm going to be going there. And this was in LA in California. And he wouldn't have it that we would be separated. He was like, I'm coming with you. And I'm like, okay, well, now mind you, he doesn't have a green card at the time. He's on a student visa. His father was on a student visa. And so if he leaves his program, he loses his visa status. So somehow he talked me into very matter-of-factly that we should get married legally so that he can come with me to California. So I didn't tell my parents this. I ended up marrying him legally in that year that I graduated. And then he and I moved to LA, which turned out to be quite the trauma experience. 4 months in LA was enough for me. But even that time, again, my mom gave me the silent treatment, obviously, from the time of the engagement all the way into the fall. So here I am again, trying to launch my independent life for the first time, moving far away from my family. And I've got silent treatment on mom's side. And poor dad is just desperately trying to keep the relationship going, right? Keep the connection. He would send mail to me. He would send care packages to me. He would, make plans with me. Eventually they made plans to come for Thanksgiving, and they came and visited, but she's tense the entire time and so forth. So this was my first semester, it went really well, but academically, but there were so many, there were torrential rains, there was fire, there were mudslides. And eventually, I went home for Christmas, and when we came back January, there was a major Northridge earthquake. And I didn't want to go to California to begin with because I was afraid of earthquakes. And lo and behold, here's this major earthquake, which scared the hell out of me. And I literally was packed up and ready to go back to my hometown within a few days. So back I am, and we ended up staying with my parents at the time, and then eventually got our own place and so forth. But through this time period, I'm working on my master's. I changed programs. I'm working part-time, and so I never had a sense that there was antagonism from him regarding what we were imagining our future was, right? We were already legally married, and, we're going to go and creating our life together. So I never had a sense that there was this detraction from my vision. Now, he's from a religion that was different than mine. And one of my mom's biggest complaints was, oh, you're going to marry him and his religion's going to interfere with your progress and your life and your future and all that. And I was like, no, it's not. It's, it's going to be a part of my life and I'm going to be fine. So I actually ended up having a deep interest in it because I'm a very spiritually minded person. And I went into it and I wanted to know more about it. And I'm the one who ended up practicing that particular faith tradition. And I took it very seriously because remember, I'm an all-in kind of person. I'm a hard worker. I'm going to do it all the way, right? I'm not going to half-ass it. So that's in fact what I did. And that caused, of course, more tension when I announced to my parents, hey, I'm going to do this. This is the kind of wedding I'm going to have. This is the kind of officiant who's coming and so forth. And they were not having it. And that caused more tension. My mom was so embarrassed. She wouldn't let me invite my family members. She refused for me to invite my cousins, my her side, on my dad's side, like she was so adamant against this. She was adamant against the wedding, period. So much so that, as I mentioned, she didn't go to my bridal shower. She didn't go for me for any of like the milestones, like picking a dress or the floors or any of the like specifics of preparing for this event. She was in fact totally antagonistic towards all of it. And here I am, an only child, trying to have this momentous time and event, and I'm getting completely ostracized from my own mother. How utterly harmful and abandoning, that was. It was really, really ugly. Luckily, because we had made this connection with the spiritual community and the religious community, I ended up making what I called my new substitute moms. And they, of course, were very kind to me and very interested in me because I showed interest in the faith, right? And they wanted to kind of nurture that. So they took on this role. And I'm very grateful to them because they really, really were there for me when I had no one else. And they are the ones who did my bridal shower. And they're the ones who, eventually did my baby showers in the future. And they were there for the wedding and so forth. And so that new community actually ended up being really a good part of my early marriage life. And it was a very positive part of my life at that time. So, like I said, I became particularly religiously observant. And in this tradition, I'm idealizing marriage, I'm idealizing motherhood, and I want to do both of those the best that I can, right? And I really went in, again, wholeheartedly. When I ended up finishing my master's degree, this was actually before the wedding, so the year before the wedding, my mom didn't come to that master's graduation ceremony at all. Again, that's the ostracization and alienation she was pulling, again, ruining milestones for me, where I should be feeling so good about my life and my future and my accomplishments. I'm feeling bad, feeling bad about my life, bad about myself, feeling bad as a person, like I'm not getting the kind of care and attention that one would deserve at those points. But so I started working part-time in my field. I was a mental health therapist, and I was doing workshops and seeing clients. I would see clients in individual counseling, couples counseling, and group counseling. And I really loved my work, and I loved the place I was working, and it was really meaningful for me. Fast forward, I get married. I start practicing my religion. It's visible that I'm in this tradition, and so I was worried if I would be accepted in my workplace. No problems there. But eventually, I ended up having my first daughter. And when I had my first daughter, I wanted to do it in the most beautiful and spiritual way. Like I had affirmations. I got a midwife. I was going to have a home birth. I did have a home birth. And then all these beautiful women who were my substitute moms came and were praying for me, and they were there to comfort me and help me. And it was just really beautiful. And I was so, so happy to have this really intentional space to bring this child into the world. My God, I was really, really on a high. I really wanted her to come into the world with all this good intention, with the best possible birth experience, with, no drugs in her system and so on. So that's kind of how that went out. Now, eventually, when she was under the one, I would, start resuming work again. And, I'm working part-time. But my ex basically talked me out of working, said he couldn't really manage her when I wasn't there. And she was a particularly colicky baby, so it was very challenging. Taking care of her, comforting her was very difficult. So he eventually talked me out of working. And because I had this idealization of marriage and motherhood, and I wanted to be the best possible mother and the best possible wife, I was like, oh, this is a noble pursuit. I'm going to do this for my family. Mind you, I actually had already started a doctoral program at that time, and I was doing some coursework off and on. So I was hoping to pursue a clinical psychology degree, so a PsyD, and I was doing that as well at this time. So again, I'm still trying to achieve. I'm still trying to be the best at both my academic pursuit, my professional pursuit, and this motherhood and wife life. And just to kind of flash forward for a moment, I mean, that's definitely part of what kept me in a relationship like this for so long, because I'm going to do this well, and I'm going to do it to the end, right? Like I've committed, and I believe in this, and I want to see it through. Now, like I said in the beginning, I felt like I had trust with my partner. I felt like there was autonomy and I was able to do the things I wanted to do. And I was pretty convinced we were on equal footing and we had the same ambitions for the future. But I think my hyper independence, right, was part of my blind spot. And while I was able to move us forward, right, in the marriage and in our life and, having young children and all the ideals that I had, right, like I wanted to home birth. And eventually I was like, well, I want to homeschool. And I wanted to not only homeschool, but I was going to do Waldorf education, which I absolutely love and adore. I got fully trained in that as well. And we were very involved with that community. Beautiful system of education. I was vegetarian for a while and I was so committed to that because I thought that was the ideal, right? And God bless him. I definitely think I put pressure on him to be vegetarian, and that must have been a pain in the butt for him. But, that's part of my gung-ho, like, we're going to do the best of the best. But honestly, he never offered an alternative, right? So my momentum of like this beautiful life I'm trying to create is what kept me going, right? Now, what's interesting in the relationship, and another factor I think that kept me going, is that, remember, I've got this antagonism from my own mother, right? So me trying to individuate, I'm pulling away from her. So I am pulling away and towards my own marriage, my own family. And I think that too contributed to me not seeing things as clearly as possible, because I'm pulling away from her on purpose because she's telling me, no, you can't do this. And I'm like, yes, I can. And off I go. Right. So that's another factor in keeping me in this relationship. So after marriage, again, things started to change in our relationship. As I mentioned before, we enjoyed our young adult life. We enjoyed a time when I was in my master's program and he was doing work and so forth. And we were getting involved with this spiritual community. It just, everything was great. We had regular routines and we just had a good time. There was really no major issues. But he had a technique to gaslight me. And what started happening is issues related to finances started to become apparent. So here we are in our brand new home, baby's on the way, baby's born. I'm starting to answer the phone and I'm getting calls that the credit cards are late. The bills haven't been paid. And then when I would turn around and say, hey, what's going on? He would gaslight me. He would trigger my insecurities. He would tell me I'm overreacting. He would say, feed into my narrative that I'm bad or unworthy. He would often talk about his family who lived overseas at this point. Remember, his father got a doctoral degree here, but then he and his wife and sister went back to their home country. He would say, oh, his family, no one ever complained. No one was ever like this. No one argued. Nobody made such a commotion. And of course, those are lies, but he would make it seem like I was so extreme in my, whatever demand I had, right? And so after he gaslights me, after he triggers my unworthiness, he would give me the silent treatment. So silent treatment as punishment. And then this would loop me into the patterns I was so familiar with, right? And this is where communication problems really began. So this cycle just started getting worse and worse. So anytime his shame was triggered, he would react like this. And I think it's really valuable to point out that when you and I first chatted about my story, you said it was his narcissistic strategy to control via shutting me down, but it's like shame is his big trigger. And anytime he felt any kind of shame, boom, it was projected back at me pretty vigorously, right? And the fact of the matter is he really was struggling to, do the things he needed to do about developing the family, taking care of the house, making the payments and so on. And so he was beginning to lie to me. And I didn't know the extent of the lies at that time, but he was lying about finances. And as I mentioned, we were in a newer home when we first got married, and my dad co-signed for it with the understanding that my ex was going to be able to manage it and afford it and be responsible and so forth, right? But eventually, after almost 2 years in the house, and one of the strategies he used to try to afford the house and manage it was he had his uncle, who was more like his brother, come live with us. And so that was meant to help financially, but he didn't couch it like that. He didn't say, hey, I'm struggling to keep up with this house. Let's have him come and he'll contribute to the rent. He didn't say it like that at all. He just framed it like, oh, we're going to just give him a leg up because he had gone through his own divorce not that long before. And, we're just going to help him out. Right. So we're being good and nice. I thought, of course, I'm not going to not be good and nice. Right. So he lied about that. Eventually, there was tension with this uncle in the house because, I wanted something done a particular way. Here I am, a young mother, a young wife. I want my house to look a certain way. I want the recycling to be done a certain way, So I was particularly picky and probably unnecessarily so, but still my house, right? And so then we get into an argument with this uncle, and the uncle then lays into me in front of my ex and criticizes me, disparages me, tells me that even my ex's friends don't like me, and I am in tears. I am heartbroken. I'm hearing things I never heard before. I thought these friends liked me, and, I was absolutely blindsided, and I felt so attacked. And I was particularly upset that I was being attacked in my own home, right? My own sanctuary, my own safe space. And I was so upset that he said nothing and he allowed his uncle to just rip me apart that I was like beside myself. I couldn't believe it. That was really one of the most hurtful things that I experienced in my early marriage from him. And I literally got up and went to my parents' house, and there I was, just absolutely upset and beside myself and so forth. I even called the friends and I was like, why didn't you tell me that? So here I am. They're all like, no, it's not like that. And so on. So this was one of the first times that I experienced that my ex allowed me to be exposed to abuse and didn't care less, allowed it to happen. And it was almost like he was letting his uncle express aggression towards me that he didn't do himself, right? So that was really, really disturbing. Also, when we were still in this home, one of the biggest incidents happened again where this seizure type, emotionally induced seizure took place, like similar to what I described when I was in college. So again, here we are, a young family, the uncle's living there, the finances are probably pressing on him. I'm having we have a young child and so forth, or I'm about to, I forgot when the trigger moment was. I think I was pregnant at the time. I'm absolutely beside myself, afraid of what the hell's going on? What's wrong with his health? This is something that occurred again and again. And the trigger was always by any kind of unresolved argument or unfinished business that he wasn't willing to address directly. And it would basically be me having some kind of need or complaint. And instead of addressing those, he would literally have this emotional overreaction. So it's like that parallel that my mom would do where she puffing, how are you, dare you, right? So she would get volatile like this, right? Escalate the emotions in order to have control. He would do something similar by having this complete breakdown. Now, mind you, throughout our time together, this happened again and again. It wasn't monthly per se, but it would happen fairly often. And eventually when I had all my children, they would witness this. But he never got treatment. He never found out the cause of this. He never found out a way to avoid it or eliminate it and so forth. But essentially, it really was a form of control. When he couldn't handle the emotions, when his shame was triggered to such an extent, he would have this type of response. Now, how did I react ultimately to this? Well, these patterns, like I said, continued. And instead of demanding that he do something about it, I would take on more and more responsibility. I would dig myself in even deeper. I would fill the gaps from his incompetence or whatever it is that was unresolved. But he was also negligent in terms of milestones, like birthdays, and communicating with his family on their birthdays or, major events and holidays. I would have to be the one to communicate to them. There was points where he didn't celebrate Mother's Day or my birthday at all. Meanwhile, I'm involved in a lot of things. I'm taking the kids to all kinds of events and so forth throughout this time. Now, mind you, originally we were in this new home. He brought that uncle in to kind of help manage it. He couldn't manage it, but he lied about why we needed to downsize. He's like, listen, we need to downsize. I'm thinking of starting my own consulting company. And if we downsize, we'll be in a better location. I'm being talked into it. I'm being told, hey, this is good for our future. So basically I'm saying, he lied about the reasons we needed to downsize. In fact, he was in debt. And not only that, he had lost his first job, got hired by a friend, and eventually lost that job. I found the email accidentally. Remember, throughout, some of these emotional stress-induced seizures are happening. I'm doing so much now. Like, eventually I have my third child, and there's just a lot to deal with. And throughout all of the issues of like finances, of him being fired and not being honest with me about any of this, I'm being gaslit, right? These emotional seizures are happening occasionally. And another thing that happens is that when we travel overseas to see his family, one of the last trips we went on, he got into an argument with me about something I asked for, and he proceeded to ignore me for 2 weeks straight during this trip. And this was one of the first times where I refused to fill the gap and kind of draw him out of the silent treatment. I was just like, it was over something very, very simple. I asked to be dropped off on a particular side of the street versus another side of the street because the traffic there is crazy. And he lost his mind. And I wasn't talked to for an entire 2 weeks after that. So after that visit, the following time we went overseas to see his family, I got my mom to come with me. And this was to go see his brother get married in a very wealthy Arab country, had an extraordinarily lavish wedding. So much money went into this. And mind you, this is an important part of the story because this is something that really shifted my perspective. This wedding was absolute extravaganza compared to anything you would ever see in America. Like, it was just insane, right? It was huge. And like, I had asked for the kids to have a bed to sleep on and to make sure that, you know, like the youngest one was going to be the flower girl, that whatever, you know, garments and things she needed, that the family would pay for it. He went crazy. He called me a dictator. He just laid into me. Anyway, my mom came on this trip to be kind of a buffer so that he wouldn't pull any of this nonsense while we were at on that trip. But that was like also the beginning of the end, because this was one of the first times where I was like, holy shit. The way I'm treated, what I'm given compared to what they're treated and given, it's like the disparity is huge. I was like, this is ridiculous, right? I don't ask for that kind of stuff, but like, I'm certainly even being denied like basic things, like, can the kids sleep on a proper bed and not on the floor? All right. So anyway, I think, you know, it's important to realize that I'm in this dynamic of like being gaslit. Fog is what happens, right? Fear, obligation, guilt. I married my mom. I'm in this cycle of silent treatments. I never get to address any issues or express my feelings, or this cycle will ensue. I'm overly demanding. Like everything is blamed on me. No accountability on his part. And mind you, I tried counseling very early on. I tried speaking to my parents to get them to, help me out. I tried that again later in the marriage where I was like, hey, I can't continue like this. I need somebody to give him a talk. Like, this has got to change. I had a best friend at the time who witnessed all of this too. And I was, even watched my kids when I asked my parents to kind of intervene. But each time it never helped. It always left me like in tears or being, sabotaged in some way. We were never able to make use of any of those support systems. And, the question would be like, well, how did I continue, right? Like, why did I just keep going? Well, I'm trained this way, right? I'm also involved in so many things, and those things and the things I'm doing for my kids are beautiful, right? They're pleasant. They bring me joy. And, I'm trying to help these kids grow. I'm homeschooling them. I'm taking them to the library. I'm driving them to special classes, gatherings, soccer. So this is also happening, right? Like, I'm trying to move my family forward, and I'm invested in all of this. But throughout this experience, right, I'm also very emotionally neglected. I'm very physically neglected, right? I'm pouring so much out and so little is coming back to me. And eventually it just became untenable. The withholding was just getting more and more painful. And I was less and less willing to fill the gap. So it was around, I think it was around 2008. There's this song that came on, Katy Perry's Hot and Cold. You're hot and you're cold, you're yes and you're no, you're in and you're out and so forth. And it's on the radio. And my middle child was probably, I don't know, like second, third grade at the time. And she's like, oh, that sounds just like dad. And I was like, oh my God, even they can recognize it. That really stunned me. Later on, around 2010, I'm beginning to be aware, like there's a movie I watched and I saw this kind of emotional neglect. And I recognized myself in that character, and it really kind of opened my eyes. And around 2012, like I had a lot of investment in the community. My speaking career increased and my involvement in the community was growing. And each time I was having these big advancements, you could see he was getting more and more pissed off. Like, I had a speaking engagement where I spoke to the largest crowd that I had ever spoken to. And when I got off the stage and we were walking down the hall, I was like, he didn't say anything. And I was like, well, and he's like, oh yeah, good job. Right. Very dismissive. And totally kind of like totally separate from us, right? Like a lot of the trips I would go on for my speaking engagements, for other things, he wouldn't come, right? I would take the kids on field trips, he wouldn't come. So this gap became more and more visible to me, right? And eventually, remember I said I had a best friend who kind of was witnessing all this at the time. And the interesting thing is she also was very similar to, or rather I was very similar to her mother in terms of how her mother felt neglected emotionally, even though she was this really bright woman, very intellectually advanced, very engaged in education, religious education and intellectual development and all of that. She saw such a parallel between her and her, and she always felt so undervalued and unrecognized by her own husband. And I remember sitting down to a meal with this friend of mine, and she was telling me how her mom was feeling again. Now, her mom was in her 60s at the time, and it blew my mind. I was like, oh my God, the hell if I want to be 60 years old and still complaining about this and still so unhappy. And really that was the moment where I'm like, I'm done. So in 2014, it was the first time I seriously asked for a divorce. But what he did is he emotionally manipulated me. And he drew me back in by telling me a very explosive, very profound and story of his sexual abuse as an 11-year-old by another boy. Well, unfortunately, his father used to tease him about this and belittle him about this all his life, which is really a shame. He didn't deserve that. But I think that experience and how he was treated about it really harmed him. I was utterly shocked. I had been with this person for over 20 years at this point, and he had never told me anything about this, not even an inkling. And I honestly was shocked. I was emotionally wrecked. I couldn't believe this. And of course, how the hell am I going to leave him now? Right? How am I going to say, okay, now you've told me the most vulnerable thing of your life and I'm going to walk out? So this emotional manipulation worked. It made me stay. He promised to make big changes. He committed to helping work through things. He committed to help working through his own trauma. I offered to help him and be there for him. And he was more attentive. But we ended up getting in an argument in October of that year, as we had many times before. And it was really over him giving more sympathy to someone else than to me about something I was telling him. I was like, hey, I don't like what happened. I don't like how I got treated. And he's like there giving sympathy for the other person. And at that time, he was just about to take on a new job overseas in London. And he blurts out, well, I'm going to London. I don't need you. I'll be fine on my own. And I was like, oh, wow. I was like, that. So at this point, this precipitated almost 6 months of complete silent treatment. I refused this time to make any effort to bridge the gap. And this silent treatment just went on and on and on and on. And I come to find out we have a lien on the house because he hadn't paid a bill in like 3 years. So this is all shocking revelation. Meanwhile, I'm still homeschooling. I'm still trying to manage 3 other children, right? 3 other children. Notice I just said that. He was like a child.
So listening to all of this, you're dealing with someone who was coddled when he was younger.
Correct.
Now you find out he had a lot of trauma when younger, and the empathetic version of you, the person who's always been the people pleaser who really can't let someone else suffer. You have to hold their hand through everything. The psychology of who we're dealing with is someone who says they want to have a family, says they want to be married and have kids. But the reality is that they really want the coddling. They've been used to this coddling their whole entire life. And you not coddling them is a problem, but them also not participating, and they can't see how not participating is a problem. And their only known ways of how to deal with things is to withhold affection, is to minimize you, is to blame you, is to deny things. They themselves are in a trauma where they're hiding things out of shame, and they live in a lot of shame, but they're also, I think, used to people doing everything for them or fixing everything for you. So now you're in this role of being their parent. You're in this role of being their fixer. And you're in this role of trying to be this communicator. And now you're done trying to be this facilitator of communication. You're done because you're always being drawn onto their side of things. No one's seeing your side of things, what you have to deal with, everything that you're dealing with. And now when you're like, I'm not going to jump to that other side, there's no communication. There's nothing. And it shows how much work you are actually doing and how little they have to do. So now you're at this point, you're about to ask for a divorce here. So what happens from this point going forward?
Brandon, that was a extraordinary analysis. You hit every nail on the head there. Thank you for that. And so here we are, early 2015, and like I said, I'm done. I find out that there's a master's program that I think will be really valuable to me if I continue this community work. So I now have my sights set on that. I have my sights set on this divorce. And, I end up calling him and saying, you can stay there. Congratulations. And he goes bonkers. He's begging for another chance, but he's also criticizing me heavily. He's offering to go to counseling. He writes this long email and, mind you, 20 years ago, I tried to take him to counseling. Now, all of a sudden, he's willing to do it. That's ridiculous at this point. He's pleading and then criticizing. He's accusing me of doing harm. So within this tradition, this religion that we're involved in, you have a religious ceremony. And in order to break that marriage ceremony, you have to get it done through the religious officiant. He's refusing that, right? He's refusing that. He's refusing the legal divorce. And he ends up returning back to the States quite soon. Now, when my mom finds out about this, I'm thinking, okay, she's going to be a support. Nope, she goes bonkers too. She calls the religious officiant, who she's never had anything to do with, and this entire time she didn't even want me to be in this religion. She tells him to not grant me a divorce, calls this stranger, tells him, don't give my child a divorce, right? Now, what's also fascinating is that this religious community that I was very involved with, I'm, as I mentioned, a speaker and involved with other religious officiants, right? They all know me. They refuse to help me. They refuse to get me, to grant me the divorce and so forth, right? So now these connections, these supports that I had, these ties to the community, they abandoned me as well. And mind you, I have grown in my community work over like the 10 years prior to that, and with these actual people, and they all abandoned me and offered me no support. Eventually, I make the plan. I'm like, well, this is going forward. And I feel some real relief in the beginning, but Brandon, you know what happened? I immediately started having startling awake every time I would go to sleep. So my nervous system went bonkers when I finally made the decision to go through the divorce. Like my body was my nervous system was in havoc. And honestly, that's something really important I want to share with listeners, is that your nervous system is tied into these relationships. It's not just a mental thing. It's not like, oh, why didn't you leave? Well, your whole body is trained in this way. And to break it and to get out of these systems, your body even rebels, right? Like, so I had startle reflex constantly when I would try to fall asleep. I lost weight, like a lot of weight in the very beginning, right? The stress was huge to make this cut, to say I'm moving on, I'm leaving. So I eventually made plans to go on for this master's degree. I wanted my kids to come with me. The younger and the middle one were still homeschooling. The older one was already starting community college. So I was convinced I was going to take them with me and start this new life. Oh, they rebelled tremendously. They did not want to have anything to do with it. Mind you, I tried to get us into counseling. He sabotaged it. They sabotaged. I tried again to get us in another counseling. They sabotaged and so forth. Absolutely oppositional to me. The kids totally went opposite what I would have expected. I was shocked really at the beginning. Absolutely shocked, because I'm the one doing everything with them. I'm taking them everywhere. I'm the one who's spending the majority of the time. I've got such an investment in them. I care about them. My God, they're my kids. I love them. I've given everything to them. And now they don't want to have anything to do with me. And what I noticed is he allowed them to be rude to me in front of them. And this started to get worse and worse and worse. So eventually, like I said, I move on to this program. I start going and my kids decide to stay and he allows it. No one's supporting me. And it was like suddenly the power dynamic completely shifted. I wasn't a parent anymore. I was demoted from my position of mother, decision-making completely. They got to decide where they wanted to be, and that was it. Mind you, they were still all under 18 at this time. Okay. And, the oldest went through a lot of her own struggles at this time. She really did very poorly. And then come to find out she's lying to me about all kinds of things. She's lying about her school. She's lying, she's failing things. She's doing things without telling me. And it really got quite bad. And I ended up getting discarded by all of them. Right. I'll get to that in a little bit, but in terms of the divorce process, it was like dragging. I had to initiate everything. Can you imagine? I'm the one who had to find the mediator. I'm the one who had to find the lawyer. I'm the one who had to get our house ready for sale eventually, like find the real estate. He was dragging his heels constantly through all of this. And he never complied with the first document was called separation decree. He never complied with it. He never complied with the divorce decree, specifically related to communication, decision-making regarding the girls' visitation and paying for the visitation. He disregarded our original agreement. He had obligation for spousal support payments, and he did that for the most part. And then eventually he just stopped, and I had to take him to court again. And he complained that he was, having neurological issues and that, he didn't have the finances and he didn't have a job and all of this. Meanwhile, come to find out, he's sending money overseas to a real estate agent. He's sending money to his brother who lives in that city, okay, which is where he lives now, right? Somebody can't pay me. And meantime, I'm still trying to maintain a relationship with my kids, but they began to ignore me, dismiss me. They demonstrate very demanding behavior, very entitled. They're dismissive of me, and they're like beginning to really turn their back on me. And some of that's understandable, right? Kids are angry, they're frustrated that their life is changing in a divorce experience. But man, it was like a little band, a gang, right? And what ended up happening over time is that communication with my daughters always was accusatory. No matter what I did or said, they saw what I did or said as aggression. You're always angry. You're always this. You're always that. And they end up being abusive towards me.
So eventually something happens with your youngest, and it's a long game event or a long con in a way to make it so it will become difficult for you to get custody of her in the future. Your youngest comes to live with you, and you're doing your best to help with her homeschooling curriculum while you're busy with your school yourself. And things seem like you two are good. You laugh together, have fun, but then an event happens where eventually you realize it was all a setup. So walk us through this.
I go to my email and I open my email and there's an email from my lawyer saying, "Hey, I'm sorry it didn't work out." And I'm like, "What? What do you mean it didn't work out?" I read the attachment. In it is a letter from my ex's lawyer telling me that I have created a hostile environment, that she's been abandoned, that I'm neglecting her, and that he's going to come and pick her up that evening from another state. That's 7 hours, 8 hours away. And I'm like, my mind is blown. I can't even fathom it. Now, there's more to the story I'm not telling you, of like things I tried to do to help the girls, to help them with their schooling, to help them with, their SATs, getting ready. I can't believe, so at this moment I shut down. I'm like, oh my God. I just walk out of the house. I think I had a friend in the area at the time. I'm like, pick me up. I need to go for a ride. I can't even believe this. I can't even process this. Thank God that friend was there. She was so helpful because she's just got such an intellect. She was helpful to help me kind of see like what's going on. So I eventually come back to the house and I talk to my daughter and I say, "What is this? What is going on?" She's like, "Well, you wanted to get custody of me and I don't want it." So I realized she'd been planning this with all of them to paint me in this terrible picture so that if I were to pursue custody, that there would be a case against me. oh my God, the plotting and the deceit. I couldn't believe it. Now, mind you, this is 2019. My conversations with the girls were decreasing my communication with them. They were no longer in the group chat. Eventually, after she leaves, I don't really hear from any of them anymore, really, Brandon. And honestly, throughout this period, and it was your show actually where I began to learn about parental alienation. I didn't have the language for that. I didn't know what that was. But one of the biggest ones, of course, is there's no subtlety in the way you understand the targeted parent, right? They're either all good or all bad. And, there's this kind of complete cutoff and blaming and entitlement and so forth. And the way it was described in your podcast, and then I think your guest who does this work regularly, just really, it shocked me. First of all, it opened my eyes so much. And I realized, oh my God, I have been this targeted parent and I've taken on all the blame that they have thrown on me uncritically, right? And just blaming myself. So part of my healing journey has really been learning to get rid of that guilt, to be my own person, to really feel like I can have my own life, my own being. And it's not been an easy process. And one of the other bigger awakenings for me is one time I was listening to a different podcast. It was actually about Alcatraz and the mob bosses. And, that's one of the most high intense prisons that ever existed. And then it talked about how, and then this mob boss came up for parole. And I went, the mob boss got parole? And I don't get any kind of forgiveness? I'm worse than a mob boss? How can that be possible, right? It just shocked me, and it just really opened my eyes, right? It was a lot of undoing. But essentially that kind of brings us towards the end of this story. There's certainly more, but I have to say that learning from your podcast, learning about parental alienation has been really a major shift in my health and growth in the last few years.
So, we've heard your whole story. We're here at this point of your story. But when it comes to you and your feelings, this isn't easy to deal with. And your day-to-day, it's not just a loss of a marriage. We're talking about losing your kids. They're not yours anymore. They're these people and they don't like you, or they think they don't. They've been in such an environment for so long that the parental alienation has worked. So on a day-to-day basis, you obviously are going to be struggling. How do you get through the day, and what are you telling yourself about this can change? Or are you at a certain point where you're this is my reality and I have to accept that this is my reality? So where are you? And I guess, what is your day to day what does that suffering feel like?
Great question. I think a couple of things. One, at this point, I'm working out what we call radical acceptance, right? Earlier, I really worked on trying to validate my right to have my own existence. Obviously, I have been through my own therapy. I have good friends, and I have really benefited from two of my family members who were witnesses for me and with me through all of this. And as I mentioned earlier in the story, I didn't have the leverage, right? Because my mother alienated me from everybody. Everybody's an enemy to her if they're not her, and they're not idealizing her, right? So even if I did, remember, and I'm also isolated from anybody having any input here, right? There's no one witnessing this on my behalf. No one's seeing it fairly. It's all the blame and all that can come sliding on an avalanche onto me, but there's no one witnessing. But when it really took a lot of tenacity to break away, one, from my community, from my marriage, from my relationship. I had to really be, catapulted out. If I had, and I really didn't talk to my immediate community, the religious community in particular, about what was happening, because I knew if I started hearing from them, I would start doubting myself and so on. I had a mentor who was really helpful for me from my Waldorf education time, who really was a backbone for me at the very early periods and throughout to help me see things correctly. I needed someone to witness with me. And that's really the biggest gift I've been given. Now, I'm on this trajectory trying to deconstruct myself and reconstruct myself, right? Because how I live my life now is very different. And it took a lot of tenacity. And it took a lot of support from my cousins and my mentor who know my mom. And another thing, two things that helped a little bit more recently, my half-sister telling me about the history of my mom and her narcissism and how it predated me, that was so eye-opening. Because all of these support systems have helped it take it out of me and put it into perspective, right? I have internalized so much blame. I have internalized so much of their aggression, their rage, that I just let them down, right? They say that I let them down financially. Why didn't you work for us? They said. I'm like, where the hell did they get this from? I literally gave my life to them, but they're like, you didn't do anything for us financially. Why? You've left us vulnerable. They believe, even till today, that I've abandoned them, right? Mind you, they're the ones who don't communicate with me. And you ask the question, how do I manage? What do I do? One of the things I made a decision about is I recognize that I'm always doing it all, right? I'm the one initiating conversations. I'm the one checking on them. I'm the one trying to, in the very beginning, we had a shared Google Calendar and I tried to communicate. We had a group chat, I had so many things I tried to continue to keep engaged with them. So there's no abandonment on my part, but I realized that I'm the one initiating everything. I have to let this go. And if they want to communicate with me, they can pick up the phone. If they want a relationship with me, they can pick up the phone. And it was shortly after that I realized I've got to stop doing it all. And I have to learn how to live my own life. I have to put one foot in front of the other and keep pursuing my goals. I'm at the dissertation phase of my doctoral degree, and it has been, can you imagine, doing a doctoral degree is hard enough, let alone through all of this. My fortitude is strong. My spiritual life still sustains me, even though it looks a little different than it did before. And again, just learning and finding the words and kind of getting that perspective, placing myself outside of these dynamics and just observing them from afar, right? And recognizing that I don't need to be a perfect human being to be worthy of love. I don't need to be faultless to be worthy of connection. I don't have to be a martyr in order to get the time and attention from my own children. If they don't have the capacity to see me as a real person and a whole person, and they choose to continue to project their own anger, frustration, and rage onto me, I cannot control that. So part of my healing is letting go.
And if you had any words of wisdom for everyone listening, what would they be?
I think it's important to recognize how much your nervous system is involved in this, as I mentioned earlier, and recognizing that you have to be patient with your body and your mind as you make decisions to separate, as you make decisions to be independent, that will have consequences for you financially and emotionally and related to all aspects of your life, right? This is no small accomplishment to separate yourself from this type of abuse and this level of abuse. And it's important to have other sources of information, other sources of eyes on this who can help you see things accurately and fairly. And to learn how to step away from the burden of fear, the burden of obligation, the burden of guilt, and to recognize that you are a worthy human being who deserves to exist and to create and forge your own life and your own path. And you don't need to be perfect to be worthy of your own life.
Well, Molly, I really want to thank you for being here with us today and sharing your story. I think it's really important to have people hear how intergenerational trauma and what you dealt with can create like a reenactment with people, and that you're in this cycle. You're part of this cycle, and it's actually continued in a big way because it's now with your children, and how difficult that it must be to know that your mom, found her way throughout your whole entire life to affect it in some way, and unable to kind of get that separation, and how heartbreaking it is. And I just really want to thank you again for being here and sharing your story. You're going to help a lot of people who are going through the exact same thing. So just a really big thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Brandon.
Well, thank you, Molly, for being here once again. And if you want to be a guest like Molly was today, please do go to our website at narcissistapocalypse.com and click on the guest form button at the top of the page. There you can read all of our instructions, and please read them all and either send us an email at narcissistapocalypse@gmail.com or fill out our guest form and press the submit button. And please do send it in the format that we ask for. Also, at our website, we have a support group. So if you need support, we have a support group. Click on the support group button at narcissistapocalypse.com. Inside, you'll see that we have Zoom meetings every Wednesday night, Thursday afternoons, and Saturday nights. We have forum boards for you to post on to get the validation that you need from survivors just like you. It's a wonderful group of people on there, and you can make a lot of friends too. So if you need support, join our support group today. And if you need even more support, please do visit our friends at domesticshelters.org. At domesticshelters.org, they have articles and resources to help you make sense of everything that you're dealing with. And they have every phone number, email address, web address for shelters and agencies, no matter how big or small the town you're in. Domesticshelters.org has it there. So if you need extra support, please do go to domesticshelters.org. And we have friends of the show called Shelter Movers, everyone. And Shelter Movers can be found at sheltermovers.com. And what they do is they help move all of your stuff from your home into storage. And that can be your pets and livestock too. So if you're trying to get out of domestic violence and coercive control and you need help leaving the home, getting all of your stuff out of your home and into storage, Shelter Movers can help you with all of that, including your pets and livestock too. They are only available in Canada, and it is a donor-supported charitable organization. So if you need help from them or just want to donate to them, go to sheltermovers.com. And that is it for today's survivor story, for today's episode. So for myself and Molly, we hope you have a good night.